He nevertheless seems to have believed in something of the same kind of a divinity that we speak of in this synagogue. We do not believe in an ineffable God, a God about whom nothing can be said except that he is a supreme being. We are suspicious of ineffable gods or gods who cannot be identified. And that is why we are interested in seeing that a poet who never read Judaism as a civilization also identifies God not as a Superman sitting on a cloud, but wherever there is ethical behavior in action. That is the theme of Tagore's poem, Where We Can Find God. By the way, you'll see there is a Hebrew translation which was done by a Hebrew poet, and it was adapted from this. The Hebrew version here was adapted from that Frischmann translation. Tagore, like Kaplan, sees God in ethical behavior in action, not in the behavior of some supreme being sitting on a cloud. And this is the kind of God we believe in here, or at least we teach here, a God we can identify in human life in ethical behavior in action. Our ancestors preferred to say that there was a supreme being who possessed certain attributes, such as the attribute of mercy, the attribute of righteousness, the attribute of truth. We would prefer to say, as Reconstructionists, not that God has attributes, that God is his attributes. God conceived of as a power or as a force. So instead of saying God is merciful, by which we have to get the impression, overwhelmingly, of a man who happens to be merciful, and this, by the way, was a great stumbling block to the philosopher Maimonides, who argued very convincingly that if we say that God is merciful, it means that God cannot be the source of mercy, because we are judging God to be merciful by, in terms of a standard of reference external to God, just as if we say something is brown or black, we are judging the object brown or black in terms of a standard external to what we are judging to be black. Maimonides got over this problem by saying you cannot say anything positive about God. You can't say that God is good, you can only say that God is not evil. Actually, I don't know why people made such a fuss about Dr. Kaplan's idea of God, because Maimonides is worse, in the sense that it takes away from the divinity any kind of concept that we can grasp hold of. It is a very negative. His whole theory of divinity is what he calls the theory of negative attributes. We cannot say what God is. We can only say what God is not. We would prefer to say that God is his attribute, so that whereas our ancestors said God is merciful, which first of all raises a philosophical problem, and secondly indicates that God is a superman or a man or a being somewhere on the analogy of ourselves, instead of saying God is merciful, we would prefer to say mercy is godly, or mercy is God, so long as the listener or the prayer would not go on and make a thing, reify what essentially is not to be made a thing of. The crucial idolatry in the 20th century surely is making a thing or making an entity about what, with our modern sophisticated knowledge about nature and reality, can no more be made a thing or an entity. Wherever there is ethical behavior in action, there is revelation of God. In our prayers, we say that God is Moshiach, Melech Ozeru Moshiach Umagen. God is a savior, one who saves, one who affords salvation. What is this savior? Is God a life savior, like a man who jumps into a river or the sea or a stream to rescue, or a swimming pool to rescue someone who is drowning? Clearly not. We, religious humanists, translate that concept of Moshiach, God as a savior, and see its modern functional equivalent in that which not only religious men but many scientists observe in man functioning in an unobstructed fashion, namely man's will to live. Man's will to live is part of nature, and man's will to live is a symbol, a sign of man's desire for fulfillment and salvation. And therefore, when we say Melech Ozer Moshiach, so far as we say it in Hebrew, we identify with a concept which our ancestors had many years ago, when they believed that literally God was the analogy of the lifesaver, capital L, capital S. Moshiach the Savior who was the Savior. And we see the equivalent of that in man's will to live, which is the manifestation of the divine. And it is very important in our century, especially when we have so many sad, pessimistic, miserable people who are constantly looking at the world from a morbid standpoint. Believe me, there's a lot to make one miserable in the world today. You only have to look at the New York Times any morning and jump out of the window if you really take it so seriously. Nevertheless, it's the old story of the glass being half full or half empty. And if we can be, as the rabbis say, malamed zechut, look at things from a positive side. If one has to speak about the cosmos, let us at least say what can be said positively about it. It may not be much, and it may only be, in fact, that the glass is half empty, but it's better to say that it's half full, because then we are made to feel a little happier. And if we are made to feel a little happier, maybe we'll work a little harder, and the glass will get a little fuller of water. But if we say that the glass is half empty, we will probably throw up our hands in disgust and not do anything about the world, and the glass will soon be emptied of all the life-giving water. This by way of reminding you all that tomorrow is a very important anniversary in Jewish life, world over, namely the 20th anniversary of Youth Aliyah. It is Youth Aliyah Day tomorrow. And it seems to me that of all the many organizations in Jewish life which we have, Youth Aliyah surely is, from our point of view, according to our way of thinking, a true manifestation of the divine in Jewish life. One of the most positive and creative expressions of Jewish desire not to depend upon some supernatural celestial Moshiach or Savior, but for the Jewish people to cooperate with each other to save, and therefore to embody in life, to articulate in life, the divine quality of saving. Youth Aliyah is an outstanding testament to man's ability to help his fellow man, to translate aspirations into practical realities, and to transform concerns into solutions of individual needs. Over the last many years, over $53 million has been contributed by Hadassah alone to the program of Youth Aliyah. And for the last 20 years, Americans have been paying annual tribute to this wonderful organization, and tomorrow, Child's Day, will be observed on Sunday, March the 31st. There are special events throughout the United States. We are not having anything specific for the synagogue, but I'd like to suggest that we all make a special event of Youth Aliyah this year by making a contribution in money, a little private event of signing a check for Youth Aliyah. It can be $1, $100, $1,000, or $1 million. You can take your pick, whatever you find most comfortable, and perhaps even if it isn't entirely comfortable, it also doesn't matter terribly. As you all know, Youth Aliyah is largely preoccupied with the problem of the resettlement of children in Israel. And this week, our hearts and our eyes are on Israel. Sha'alu Shalom Yerushalayim. We pray for the peace of Israel. Let reason and understanding, not hatred and vituperation, prevail there. Let God be revealed in Israel, as in the world, in acts of creative survival for peace, for all men, regardless of color, race, or creed. Let us find, perhaps, that we are reminded of this theme by the words of an Eastern, non-Jewish, Gentile poet, of the creativity which is present in all of the families of the earth, and which, if only we could develop those conditions of peace, would be reciprocally and mutually life-giving and invigorating. V'shav Yaakov v'shakat v'sha'anan v'ein rachrid v'ein macharid. We pray that our brethren in Zion and throughout the world may be permitted to lead their lives without fear. May God be revealed, not only in all those parts of human life where man is creative, but especially in the talk of peace and in the words of peace. And now on page 343 in the prayer book, Please join with me in reciting the indented sections of the English prayer, which commences on page 343 and concludes on page 349, the indented sections of the English prayer commencing with the opening two lines, the bottom of page 343. God, where shall I find thee, whose glory fills the universe? Behold, I find thee wherever the ploughman ploughs his furrow through the hard soil, wherever the quarryman pounds the stone to gravel, wherever man earns his bread by the sweat of his brow, in the company of the friendless, the afflicted, the lowly, the lost. Behold, I find thee wherever the mind is free to follow its own bent, wherever words come out from the depths of truth, wherever tireless striving stretches its arms toward perfection, wherever men struggle for freedom and right, wherever the scientist toils to unbear the secrets of nature, wherever the poet strings pearls of beauty in lyric lines, behold, I find thee in the merry shouts of children's play, in the lullaby the mother sings, rocking her baby to sleep, in the slumber that falls on the infant's eyelids. Behold, I find thee when comes the dawn with her golden cornucopia, or when evening falls bringing peace and rest from the western ocean of rest. Thou art in the joy that streams from heaven with the morning light, in the current of life that courses day and night through my sinews and through all nature, in the life that throbs exultant in the dust of the earth and through the blades of grass innumerable. Behold, I find thee in the wealth of those passing delights that live but for a moment, in the pulse beat of a life that comes from eternity and dances in my own blood, in birth that keeps renewing the generations. O my God, fill me ever with new life. Give me strength to keep my body pure of all stain and perversion, and my mind of all illusion. Banish all evil from my heart, and remove all pride from my spirit. Grant me discernment, that I may discover thee in all my achievements, that my life be ready and at thy disposal. O my God, give me the strength never to desert the helpless, never to bend the knee before a haughty tyrant. Enable me to live my life above the vanities of the daily round, to bear serenely joyous and anxious moments. Give me the ability to thank thee for even the poorest dwelling, for even the most meager portion in life, for abundant are the gifts thou hast given me, the sun and the light, this my flesh, life and the soul, treasures invaluable, treasures of life and love. I just woke up one morning and I felt terrible, sick. I realized that I was over 30. My hair was coming out in patches. I was developing a middle-age spread. I went to the doctor. Miller, he said, it's no good. We all go the same way. The future is with the young. I didn't mind so much losing my hair and developing a middle-age spread, but I resented bitterly the fact that I had been out on a new morality. Why couldn't they have invented the pill? Why couldn't Joseph Fletcher have written his classical text 30 years ago, so I could have been in the swing of things? I had now to grow old and watch all the young people living it up. I had led a virtuous life as a young man. We accepted the discipline of our parents. We believed that our parents knew all the truth. Why couldn't I have been privileged to have been born in an age when I could have told my parents where to get off, gone and lived in a little pad on the west side, and done exactly what I wanted? I mean, it wouldn't have been so bad if I had been 70 or 80 or 90 when this all came about, but I was just at the crucial point where I had just missed it and had none of the blessings of old age to look forward to for many, many years. I resented this whole thing bitterly, and as I resented it gradually, the figures of the two central myths of this swinging age, which I, because of my post-30 situation was condemned to miss. Two mythical symbols functioned in that cosmos, in that paradise from which, like Adam and Eve, I had been inevitably, inexorably, and irretrievably banished. One was playboy male, the other was cosmopolitan girl. I stayed awake at night dreaming of the epitomes of perfection represented by these two mythical characters. Cosmopolitan girl wasn't married. She was in her about 28 or so, an age of maturity in a woman. She was intelligent. She had a degree from the finest colleges. She was a model. She worked for the finest shops in the whole of the country. She was part of the jet set, most attractive, a la Milas, as my mother would have said, a la Milas. She had no intention of having children. Cosmopolitan girl didn't even have parents, so they could ring her up and ask her what she was doing. She had no brothers or sisters or cousins, so when somebody died, she never had to go to a funeral. Funerals and cosmopolitan girls don't go together. So these, as it were, these girls that I used to dream about, belonged into a universe where no one grew old, no one grew sick, no one had to pay condolence calls, no one had to write condolence letters, nobody visited Shiva. It was a beautiful, clean world without blemishes, without spots, without gray hairs. Everything was perfect. And I harnished for it. And there was no future because I was over 30. And everybody told me that once you are over 30, cosmopolitan girl is not for you. Playboy male lived by himself. He also had no parents, so that his mother couldn't ring him up and ask him why he wasn't wearing the other tie. He was totally isolated. He also was not involved in funerals. He was a rugged type like Hugh Hefner. He lived all by himself. All the latest perfections of the steroid world in which we live were his. Everything was press button. His breakfast, everything. By the way, his refrigerator was almost empty. It just had a bottle of gin remaining cold so that he could mix his martinis to perfection. For many, many years I struggled with this horrible feeling that there was a paradise from which I had been excluded, in which lived the ideal cosmopolitan girl and the playboy male. Yenta the matchmaker might have said of this ideal world, the way she looks and the way he thinks and behaves, it's a perfect match. None of the obligations of child rearing, none of the obligations of honoring thy father and thy mother, none of the obligations of trying to meet the deficit of a synagogue annually, none of the obligations of becoming chairman of a committee or serving with a social action group, none of these defects and drawbacks were for these characters. And then, thank God, one day I began to sleep a little better. I had discovered that cosmopolitan girl and playboy male don't really exist in reality. It was because of mixing with people, boys and girls under the age of 30, who were supposed to be living in that paradise, and hearing them complain about what was happening in that so-called paradise, that drew my attention to the fact that the 5 million people who read the Playboy myth monthly are in fact almost in as bad a condition as I am, that the ideal types are what they also dream about, but in fact do not exist in reality. It occurred to me that in Chicago, this kind of house that they have there, in which Mr. Hefner lives, is a sort of a monastery. It seems to me that it is a kind of, I know it sounds surprising to use a theological term for such a thing, but first of all, it's non-productive. The people who live there are cloistered. There are no children. And it seems to me there are kind of rules of the order, which, frankly, in spite of our fantasies, you and I would probably find somewhat arduous. I, for example, like to go to bed fairly early, and I like to sort of relax when I have a moment which isn't consumed with meetings. And the idea of having, as it were, vodka to stay up and have an orgy every night in the week is something which I think, it seems to me a bit like heaven. I don't think I could stand it much very long. I feel a terrible urge simply to sleep for a long time and maybe go and fast and daven a little just to get over the after effects. I see it then as a monastery of a kind, where, true, the rules of the order are not as exacting as the medieval asceticism of St. Francis or St. Bernard. But nevertheless, where there are rules, God forbid the man who lives in that monastery who suddenly questions whether this is the ideal good life, whether perhaps there may not be other things to do. You will notice that Playboy magazine, I'm sure you don't. I'm probably the only one who looks at it occasionally here, but let me explain to you. I am sure that you will realize that in fact some very serious issues are almost entirely ignored in that worthy magazine what we call the real ethical issues of modern life, the real grassroots ethical issues of modern life. Because, you see, if somebody thinks about this sort of problem, you begin to wonder whether you should be living it up in this orgiastic way, and whether perhaps one shouldn't be sharing things out a little with others who are less fortunate than oneself. So that there are certain subjects which are not raised, almost like at college, where if one mentioned certain subjects, one was punished. At least in my college that happened. The punishment wasn't so bad. One had to drink a large quantity of beer. But it was a kind of a punishment symbolically, and one had to pay for it, which made the punishment even harsher. I want to talk this morning for the benefit of all the congregation, but particularly for the young people, some of whom I hope are under 30, who will be joining us for our luncheon this morning in the social hall after the Kiddush. I want to talk about the Jewish family. Before talking about the Jewish family, which as a rabbi I often have to speak about, I want to make clear something which in the past I have not always made clear. And that is that the attitude in Jewish life today towards the single man or woman will have to undergo a radical change. We are going to have to rethink a great deal of our ethical solidities, our assumptions and our axioms. We are going to have to be a little more understanding of people who simply do not want to get married, of people who do not want to have children, of people who are not able to have children, do not wish to adopt children. We are going to have to pay some greater measure of respect to those kinds of people caricatured vulgarly and grossly by Cosmopolitan Girl and Playboy Male. Like all stupid things, both myths have an element of reality. In the pre-modern world, in the shtetl, for example, the prototype of Cosmopolitan Girl, the spinster, described by Zaborowski and Herzog, had a very, very unpleasant time. She didn't measure up to the demands of a childbearing society where yichus and nachas and everything else that ends in es came from having children. And therefore, because she didn't measure up to the standard criteria of what it meant to be a full human being, she was made to live with somebody else. She couldn't have any kind of a pad, whether bachelor or her own. And there she suffered. Probably she had to do a little more washing up than anybody else. And no doubt Mama, every time something cropped up, she said, "Oh, I say, Becky, why doesn't she?" And so on and so forth. And Becky had to endure this for all the time until she became either so inured to it, or the others accepted her around as a kind of a source of irritation and an indication of failure, but nevertheless as something not quite right. We must recognize the fact that in pre-modern Judaism, the attitude of our ancestors towards the relationship between having children and having meaning in life is directly related to the ancient desire and will to survive on the part of the Jewish people. And in an age where the problem is population explosion, we are going to have to radically, as Jews, rethink the whole attitude towards the family and the place of children within the family. And clearly, an ethic which more or less beats people over the head that they have to produce children, and that if they are not producing children, there is something wicked or malevolent or maybe wrong about it, summarized in the ancient rabbinic conception that if a man was married for a certain period of time and his wife didn't produce children, this was legitimate grounds for divorce, which the modern mind finds horrendous, and which indeed, as I will suggest later, is not truly reflected in the earliest and more spiritual sources of our tradition. And in fact, the rabbis themselves felt a little embarrassed. They only, as it were, devised this law because they said the first mitzvah was be fruitful and multiply, and they felt they ought to measure up to this. But in fact, they tell many stories where this was never actually done, and when the man suggested it should be done, there was one particular case of a lovely story where they come, I think, to Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai in the 2nd century. We've been married for 10 years, we couldn't have any children, and we wanted to be divorced. So Shimon ben Yochai said, "All right, I don't mind, but at least go out and have dinner and live it up for one night, and then come back tomorrow and I'll give you your divorce." So they went back and they had a party, and they drank a little too much, and the husband, under the influence of his cups, the story is found in the Midrash. I suppose that makes it kosher, doesn't it? And in the interest, he says to my wife, he said, "Whatever you want in this house, my house," he says, "when you go back to your father's house, you can take from this house whatever you want, the most precious thing you can find in the house." Then he falls asleep because he's so drunk. So the wife calls her slaves from outside. Obviously, She came from a wealthy background. And they pick up the husband and they wrap him up and they take him to her father's house. So when he wakes up in the father's house, he says, "What am I doing here?" She said, "My beloved husband, you told me I could wrap up the most precious thing I could find in your home." I did. So they went back to Shimon Bar Yochai the next day, and they said they didn't want to get divorced. And Shimon Bar Yochai said, "Mazel tov," and they went and they lived happily ever afterwards. I think this story, as it were, modifies the harsh law of a divorce after 10 years of inability to bear children. By the way, it's very interesting. How did they know before modern sterility tests that it was the woman's fault? They took it for granted, of course. It was a man's world. Now, we have to change that attitude in modern life, and therefore I say that Jews got to learn to accept, as part of reality, the man or woman who deliberately or otherwise, even because he or she may have sexual attitudes which differ from the norm, such people, in radical distinction to traditional judgment, must be regarded as part of the community and must be regarded as good as anybody else, so that the homosexual will have to be regarded with as much respect as a married man with 15 children. It's going to be difficult for many of us. And certainly there is no sanction in ancient Jewish tradition for this, where the homosexual has to be stoned to death. But few of us take that seriously today. I say few, some do. I won't mention any names, it wouldn't be fair. They don't live too far from here. Now, the important thing then is to realize that what I say about the Jewish family does not mean the same kind of exclusivity which the Jewish family stood for in the past, whereby only the married man and woman, and among the married people, only those with children, and among those with children, only those that were nachas producing. If you had a shlemagel, God forbid, you were ashamed to lift your face in shul. God, a man who couldn't say maftir, couldn't make a little kaddish or something, terrible. We've got to relax. We've got to stop living through the children. Try to live through ourselves. Now I want to talk about the Jewish family, the future of the Jewish family, nonetheless. And some of you will say, well, we had that subject some weeks ago. Yes, but our lecturer didn't tackle the subject. Dr. Franz Blau, a very wonderful woman, spoke of the virtues of the Jewish family. But it is precisely these virtues that are in question today. She more or less told us that if we want to survive as Jews, we have to keep on with the good old Jewish virtues. But that doesn't answer the question, it begs it. We've discussed before the question which biologists ask today, do birds have wings because they fly, or do birds fly because they have wings? Do men have brains because they think, or do they think because they have brains? The answer from the evolutionary standpoint is that birds do not fly because they have wings. They have wings because they fly. What this means is basically that there was a time when what we now regard as birds did not have wings, but that at some crucial point in the past, the need arose, not in the birds, but in terms of an objective viewer who would see perhaps a group of birds isolated on some high place who are unable to fly. The need arose for that particular species, if it were to survive, for some animal to develop a crucial evolutionary differential which would enable it to have an edge over its fellows. And by the process of mutation, one bird without wings suddenly developed, or suddenly was born with wings. That bird would transmit the bird gene, as it were, the wing gene, to its successors. A differential, evolutionary differential would have been introduced. By the same token, men originally in their primitive form did not have brains, but that by the same token the need arose for a crucial evolutionary differential. And that first emergence in nature by a process of mutation, which is a normal, natural phenomenon, whereby one man's cranium was able to respond in ways which we would regard today as intelligent. That was the element, the member of the species, that possessed the advantage, the evolutionary advantage over the other members of the species. By the same token, we may ask the question, did the Jewish people survive because of the Jewish family? Or did the Jewish family come into existence because of the need of the Jewish people to survive under particular conditions? And the last is true. The Jewish people did not survive because of the Jewish family, because the Jewish family can be traced back to its origin. There was no Jewish family as you and I know of it in the biblical period. But at a certain point in our history, when Gentile powers surrounded us, and when our national sovereignty was threatened, then there arose a need for that which all men derive by way of status and identity from a land and an army and a king. The need arose for the Jew to experience that sense of identity, not by a land or by an army, which he was now removed from, but from himself alone as a member of a diaspora people. And at that point, the need arose for the bird Jew to develop something to enable him to fly. The psalmist talks about, would that he had wings to fly. So the Jewish family, the Jewish spiritual leaders, at a time when Gentile history threatened our survival, wished for wings which would enable the Jew to survive without land, without government, and without all those trappings of polity which all normal peoples have. And that was the point at which the Jewish family emerged, not like Athene, fully clothed from the brain of Zeus, but slowly and evolving over the ages until it became what it was, as many of us remember, from the shtetl and its aftermath. Therefore, we must look at the family today not as a hermetically sealed-in set of absolute values, the Jewish family, I mean, which set a pattern in terms of which all Jewish life must be measured. That is absolutely wrong. It is wrong not just from a reconstructivist point of view, it is wrong from a revolutionary point of view. To say that this particular kind of family which Jews lived in the 19th century is the pattern against which all future Jewish family patterns must be measured is infantile. It is like man trying to become an amoeba again. In life, as in evolution, we move on. The question we have to ask today is this. We are living in radically new conditions. We are again the birds on a promontory, surrounded by the hostile influences of assimilation. And the question now is, what behavior patterns, whether individually or familially, must we develop in order to be able to survive for as long as the old Jewish family enabled us to survive? And 2,000 years is a reasonable period of time to want to survive for. We're right in the middle of that period of transition, trying to evolve new patterns of behavior. What can we salvage from the old Jewish family? What new attitudes and patterns must be invested in the family behavior? Or will indeed, and this was the question we put to Dr. Franz Blau, which he did not answer, will the Jewish family survive in what we recognize it, in the form we recognize it, at all? Now, one of the biggest attacks on the whole idea of the Jewish family is, of course, in terms of the two myths, the myth of the playboy male and the cosmopolitan girl. And I don't know right now how many of our young people are agonizing and losing sleep over the fact that they can never achieve the perfection of these two ideal mythical types without realizing that, in fact, there is no basic reality to it. A distinguished psychiatrist who lectures frequently to, I better not go on any further, but anyway, remarked once to me that his couch and the couches of many of his colleagues are littered with cosmopolitan girls who, having achieved the nearest approximation possible to the so-called ideal whereby one is unencumbered by any family relationships and entirely independent, so that one really does not need to get married. One does not need to have children, as it were. In fact, have successfully cut themselves off from their basic womanhood and their basic femininity. Now, the attack on the family, on the Jewish family, I say, comes to a great extent from the purveyors of sick myths in Madison Avenue. But there is an even more serious attack, which in recent years has been rearing its head, and this does not come from the sick purveyors of sick myths in Madison Avenue, but from the sphere of science itself. I have in front of me here an article by Robert Morrison, MD, presented at the California Institute of Technology at its 75th anniversary convocation, October 66, where he announces without fanfare the anticipated decline in the prestige of the family by the end of the century. And assuming that this is the case, the Jewish family, of course, will be governed by the laws which govern all other families. He gives three reasons. I would like to enumerate them briefly. Firstly, The family, which is a fine mechanism for transmitting conventional wisdom in a relatively static society, is relatively poor at assimilating and transmitting new knowledge essential to survival in a rapidly moving world. By that, I presume he means that I cannot help my son with his new math. 2. Growing awareness of the population problem and of human genetics weakens the prestige of the family as the basic unit of human reproduction. 3. Increasing knowledge of the plasticity of the human nervous system in early life will encourage further invasion of the home in the name of ensuring equality of opportunity. And one more comment. It is considerations like this, he observes, that have led some very eminent geneticists to suggest abandoning the concept of the family as the unit of human reproduction in order to follow theoretically more suitable models derived from animal husbandry. Even more dramatic are the possibilities now being conjured up of eliminating defects and producing unimaginable virtues by tinkering with the genetic code itself. Even though it seems unlikely that a substantial number of people will shortly abandon classical methods of reproduction for the models derived from animal husbandry or bacterial transformation, it is undeniable that the progress of science is bringing about a growing separation between the phenomena associated with sexual attraction and those involving reproduction per se. Much of the conventional moral apparatus of almost all societies, however, has been based on the assumption of an extremely close tie between the two. Clearly, we are in for some big changes, the social consequences of which are not easy to see. Now, many of you must have noticed in last Sunday Times, in the science section, written by Walter Sullivan, a report of several scientists who belong to the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The conference took place in Albany, where an attempt is being made to establish at the university there of a center for science and the future of human affairs. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have a center for Judaism and the future of Jewish affairs? And it was predicted by one of the speakers at that conference, as reported in last week's Times, that human reproduction by sexual intercourse may fade away completely before the century is out. This was the thesis of Dr. Bentley Glass, geneticist, academic vice president of the State University of New York at Stony Brook. It would have to be Stony Brook. He predicted a total severance of the human sexual life from the reproductive process. This, he added, may threaten the survival of the family as the basic unit of society. And he goes on to give details of the scientific reasons for thinking that before the end of the century, artificial babies may be grown in artificial wombs outside of mothers. Now, some of you may seriously believe that technology will indeed be able to produce real babies in artificial wombs. I have my doubts about it myself, but I will be prepared to concede the point. Let us assume, for the purposes of the discussion, that babies could be produced this way, and that good babies should be produced this way. I'm not quite sure what I would mean by a good baby under such circumstances, but let's say a physically functioning baby. The fact that technology can do something, does that mean that technology should do something? We've had this problem once before in the invention of the atom bomb. Of course, we could make the atom bomb, and we did make the atom bomb. But was it a wise thing? Would humanity be better off if the atom bomb had not been invented? If somehow or other the scientists at that time in their international organization, hopefully, it was not like this of course at the time, perhaps we could even have won the Second World War without the use of the atom bomb. I am one of those who feel that the use of the atom bomb was a great moral mistake, because once one has done that sort of thing, it is much easier to do it a second time. And also there were profound immoral racist implications of using the atom bomb on yellow people and not white Europeans. Frankly, if I had to drop the atom bomb anywhere, I would rather have dropped it on Germany. In fact, come to think of it, there were times when I would have done it myself personally without any assistance. I'd have just floated there. Now, these are moral issues. Because technology can do something, ought technology do something? And I think we should point out, at this very point, that Jewish life without the family as we know it, really, by no stretch of imagination, could be described as being Jewish in any sense. Now, here we have some reputable scientists who are saying that in fact the family is almost certainly on its way out. And as Jews, we are worried. I don't know about you, but I'm a little perplexed about this. It's all said and done. I'd like to think that the family was something that was a worthwhile unit of life. Not that I'm working for a company that's going mechula. Who wants to work in a business that's going mechula? Do I want to be associated with an institution, a human society, which is on the way out? Then let's get rid of it right now. Let's throw off all bans. Put the children into a farm, a cattle farm in Central Park, and let's live it up. Let us look for a moment at the Bible and see whether some ancient insights from the past, and then we'll look to see whether all scientists, in fact, are really thinking this way. We have in the early sections of the Bible several interesting myths which speak of our ancestors' attitude towards marriage. In the biblical story of the creation of Adam and Eve, it is very remarkable that there are no babies in the Garden of Eden. In fact, the first act of sexual intercourse described in the Bible takes place in the first verse after the second creation story. And I think that says something. It does to me anyway. In this sense, that the biblical myths specifically point out the purpose of a man and woman living together is eze kenegdo, but not exclusively for sexual athletic prowess to be demonstrated. This is a very important point. Our ancestors were not, how shall I put it, squeamish about the sexual facts of life. As you know, the Bible is full of very earthy things, so much so that a lot of it is not fit to give to a first-grade child. At least that's what teachers still think, that the children know how to get the juicy bits out, as they did in my day. I mention this, that the Bible is written by a group of people who are pretty healthy-minded in sex matters. Any culture which could produce the Song of Songs knew what the facts of life were about, and they reveled and enjoyed in them. Nothing ascetic or celibate for the Jews in those days. Later on, we picked up something from the Gentiles. So a kind of a fascinator approach towards these things. But in the biblical period, enjoying a wife, family, children, these were the greatest of all possible blessings. Eze kenegdo, the Bible says. The ultimate relationship between a man and a woman is companionship. There are no children even in the Garden of Eden, and yet the biblical author still conceived that Eden was paradise. Perhaps that's why. That there was this relationship, a mutuality, a reciprocity, that a man and a woman can achieve a level of humanity, of fulfillment in each other, eze kenegdo. Secondly, the biblical account of creation speaks of man subjugating, kivshuha, subjugating the world. And this seems to me that, of course, it's only an anticipation, perhaps even unconscious, that the distinct differential between the human and the animal is that in human evolution, deliberate, moral, controlled planning takes place. That it is not simply the biological survival of the fittest which took place on a biological level. Not the fittest, but what men deem to be the most moral, which ought to survive. Thirdly, we get this insight from the Bible as a whole. That God, and this is the whole biblical theme really in a nutshell, that God wanted to create perfection in the world. And he tried to create perfection through creating a perfect man and a perfect woman. But they were disobedient, and he exiled them from paradise. He then tried to experiment to create a world of perfection by cosmopolitanism, by having masses of humanity, all the peoples of the world being given the command to lead a good life. And all the peoples of the world, en masse, cosmopolitan-wise, rejected God's law and disobeyed. The earth was full of violence. And finally God said, I will choose Abraham, who will be the father of one single people, and through that single people, following the law of God, will all the peoples of the world be blessed. And this ancient myth reflects the ancient idea of our ancestors that you cannot make a world moral by a United Nations from the top, but that morality ultimately is refracted to the individual through the unit of the family, and the family has to function responsibly and ethically within the framework of society as a whole. That the concept of the world that our ancestors had was that a people was a family of families, and the world was a family of a family of families. The principle of metabolism teaches us that you can't inject a steak directly into the bloodstream. You have to eat it. It has to be mixed with digestive juices, and then through a very complicated process, which I'm sure many of you understand much better than I do, the steak turns into blood and sinew and bones and eyes and ears and all the wonderful things that help us to live. Now, by the same token, the intuition of our ancestors was that you can't inject values directly, abstractly into the bloodstream of the individual. There is a metabolism in the world whereby only when a people functions responsibly within the cosmos, only then, and this is our Reconstructionist teaching, can that people experience God. God is always God of a people. And it is through the people experiencing God responsibly and collectively, when the people endeavors to make life meaningful for itself as a collective and for all its individual constituents, that the family within the people, responsibly linked to that people, can then, through this process of spiritual metabolism, pass on the values, so that the abstract value of freedom, hopefully and meaningfully, I trust, not just a blind repetition of the past, so the abstract concept of freedom will hopefully, in a few days' time, in the Seder service, in each and every one of our homes, be refracted through the people, present, past, and future, into the bloodstream of our own children. By the way, Judaism without the family, can you imagine, would have to change the Haggadah. It would have to be a kind of a reflective yogi Haggadah asked to oneself while contemplating one's navel, presumably after eating a heavy portion of matzah laced with LSD. Now, I would not bother you sophisticated men and women who could have been doing something more creative this morning perhaps, merely by quoting to you insights and intuitions, half-baked, clumsily expressed of men who died thousands of years ago. If I did not believe that these intuitions are indeed adumbrations of some of the most profound insights that modern science has produced, and that in fact the gentlemen who are described by Walter Sullivan represent perhaps the lunatic fringe of modern science. The biological study of behavior in recent decades seems to indicate that there is a foreshadowing of the nuclear family in nature. Ethologists have indicated that they find social organization among the higher primates. They even claim to have found proto-religion in the form of ritual in the animal kingdom, which is functionally equivalent to the more sophisticated ritual practices which may be observed among more sophisticated human beings. And always the ritual and the societal nexus is associated with a higher and more developed grouping. Psychiatry teaches us also that our very humanity and emotional stability is grounded in the familial context. The origins of love and hate, which are so basic to our emotional maturity and our understanding, grow from the fact that most of us have one father and one mother. Some of you may have seen the movie The President's Analyst, and how patchy movie, but there's one horrendous scene where we realize that the man speaking in the telephone company office, who looks like one of these smooth executives described so beautifully by Alfred Kazin, when speaking to us a few weeks ago, he said that some of the executives at these big firms are so smooth you can't tell where they end and the floor begins. This, to me, seems to epitomize what we might do to human beings. Maybe in the insight of the man who directed that movie, we have an insight into the kind of human being we might indeed be able to create. But would it be a mensch? And would this human being, in quotation marks, be able to appreciate Bach and understand or feel or empathize with Shakespeare? In other words, I am not denying for 1 minute that there is a lot of evidence which says that we could alter the family by tampering with the genetic code. The question I ask is whether that is a moral decision and whether we should. And nature seems to tell us that our deepest intuitions are not wrong. I agree that the family must change. The old extended family of the shtetl period, when grandpa and grandma kept on asking you who you were dating with, is parsnish for the modern generation. We'll have to get rid of that if we haven't got rid of it already. And mothers and fathers are going to have to learn to ask pure questions and be a little more relaxed when their children disappear and come back at 4 o'clock in the morning and don't want to be too articulate about what they have been doing. We're going to have to rely a lot more in the reconstructed family on love in the crucial years and a lot less on discipline in the years of adolescence and early maturity. In the foreseeable future, I must confess that I cannot see baby farms, and I think that the myth of the cosmopolitan girl and the playboy male is going to prove more and more unintriguing, I can't think of the right word, but you get what I mean, for our younger people. Those of you who get the Reconstructionist magazine, I hope you all do, and if you don't, you should, may also note, I just picked this up after I'd written my sermon, that there's an article here on the artificial creation of life, came out yesterday, and Joseph Bernstein, who seems to know a great deal about the subject, challenges very cogently this slick method whereby every so often in the newspapers you get this, a headline, this was synthesized, therefore tomorrow they'll have an artificial baby growing in the Natural History Museum. And this gentleman in this article, this very interesting article in the Reconstructionist magazine, points out that there's many a slip betwixt present laboratory technique and producing a full-fledged baby. Now this is what I've really got against Walter Sullivan and the scientists. I accused Hugh Hefner of living the life of a monastic, of Mirgazok, in his Chicago monastery. Now, my greatest criticism relates to the joke which is often told about the lady who went to hear a lecture on the second law of thermodynamics about the idea the universe is cooling and that one day the whole thing will finish. There'll be no more life because it will be too cold. And at the end of the lecture, elderly lady, in great trepidation, she goes over to the lecturer. Excuse me, she said, excuse me, please, Professor, did you say that the earth is going to come to an end in 3 million years or 3 billion years? 3 billion years, madam. Ah, I feel much better. Having used one theological term this morning, I will use another to describe the scientists who predict just round the corner the demise of the family, on which we Jews depend so much for what we understand as the matrix of our moral, religious, and spiritual health. They are pseudo-messianists. There is a new form of pseudo-messianism in cultural life today. What is wrong with pseudo-messianism? No one doubts that the Messiah will come. That is to say, we believe not in a physical, actual human Messiah, but that the world can be better if we try than what it is today. No one doubts that if men really worked, we could make of this, we could make New York just cleaner. I'd accept that for a start in my own lifetime. Forget about the rest. Just a clean New York, and maybe children going to sleep not hungry at night time, and children in winter clothed decently. I'll just settle for New York. No one doubts in the coming of the Messiah. Pseudo-Messianism is simply declaring that the Messiah has come when the Messiah has not in fact come. How can we say the Messiah has come? Look at the filth in our streets, both physical and moral, and how can we say the Messiah has come? How can anyone say the Messiah has come? We Jews, looking at the evil realities of the world, say the Messiah has not yet come. And therefore I say to scientists who cannot cure the common cold, who are totally inept in the face of a common, simple schizophrenia, who apart from the routine diseases rely far more on the power that makes the healing than many of us lay people would often imagine. I say to them, I'm from Missouri, show me. For the foreseeable future, for the next 3 million years, your predictions are a lot of poppycock. What you should be spending your time on perhaps, since there is a question of optimum time to be devoted in laboratories today to the betterment of humanity, is not trying to produce golems, but trying to use your God-given brains to do something about the filth that your own inventions have made of the world in which we live. If you could devote just half the time you expend on trying to create golem children, on trying to cure the filth in the air that your mass machines of pollution have created, so that our own children, percentage-wise, suffer and some even die because of this filth, you would be using your time better. Now I suggest that maybe the way in which scientists spend their time, conceivably, could be a moral decision. And the way in which money is spent lavishly on the kind of scientific programs which seem to do nothing but create hysteria among decent men and women, perhaps at least, if we are not going to exercise control in these spheres, maybe we should at least say to ourselves, war is too important to be left to the generals or to the President of the United States, and science is much too important to be left to some of these scientists, so-called. If humanity is to survive, we all are involved in the planning for the future. So I see that for the foreseeable future the family is in. Many men and women will out of free choice or force majeure not get married and not raise children, or if they cannot have children, will not adopt children. We salute and sympathize with them. But if humanity is to achieve fulfillment and not merely technical survival, we are still in for the long haul to improve the family. I'd like to conclude with another story from the Midrash, which I think sums up the Jewish attitude towards the coming of the Messiah. And these are some of the questions which I hope to discuss with some of the young people, the under 30s, well, under 30 in spirit, if not under 30 chronologically. Story is told that Joshua ben Levi, one of the rabbis, the second post-Christian century, met with Elijah, who was believed to wander about the world and occasionally hold dialogues with rabbis. And Joshua ben Levi asked Elijah, when will the Messiah come? Elijah says, go and ask him. Where will I find him, says Joshua. You will find him sitting at the city gate. But lots of people are sitting at the city gate. How will I know which one is the Messiah? The Messiah will be bandaging wounds, along with many others who will be bandaging wounds. He will be discernible because all the others, in putting bandages on the wounds of the lepers, will be taking off the old bandages en masse and then bandaging en masse. But the Messiah will be distinguished because he only deals with one leper at a time. He takes off one bandage and he puts that bandage back before he goes on. Why does he do this? Because he says that perhaps God will suddenly say the time for the coming of the Messiah has come, and I will be in a hurry, and I don't want to have to rush off to do my job as a Messiah, leaving all these poor people who look to me for hope without their bandages on. You know, this is a remarkable, profound intuition about the way in which one should go about trying to make society a better place. Some of the way in which we are expending our energies are so useless. We are all well-meaning, but in the lack of concentration, in the lack of intensification, it's like just hot air, literally steam. You have to concentrate steam if you wish it to drive anything. And by the same token, by all means, let us devise with our technology a brave new future. But until that future is moral as well as feasible and practical, let us not behave in such a fashion that we jettison those very values laboriously built up over thousands of years on which we depend for our very emotional existence. Of course, we must modify and reconstruct, but not with the myths and fantasies of pseudo-messianic scientists and Madison Avenue models, but within the framework of reality, living and meaningful reality. Amen.